outsourcing has nothing to do with economic efficiency. Outsourcing is one of the operations that take place within command economies. The economy is run by a network of command economies called corporations. I mean, what goes on internal to a corporation or a mega corporation is not free trade. It's command economy. A corporation is a totalitarian institution. You know, it has a board of directors at the top, a manager, he gives orders, everyone else follows them down at the bottom. At the very bottom, if you're lucky, you can rent yourself to it and get a job. And if you're sufficiently propagandized, you may even buy some of the junk they produce and so on. But it's certainly not, it has nothing to do with what any classical economist would have called a free market. Outsourcing is just part of the technique. Outsourcing is internal to the corporation, right? The corporation picks some supplier to outsource to and keeps them under control, because then they can get much cheaper labor, hideous working conditions, don't have to worry about environmental controls. They get inputs to themselves, which are very cheap. That increase, for those of you who've studied economics, you know that increases productivity. If you get artificially cheap inputs, that increases productivity, because productivity is measured in terms of, value produced divided by the number of workers. So you get nice measures of productivity, which have nothing to do with productivity. They just have to do with the fact that you've got 20-year-old women off the farms in China locked into factories and working until they die in a couple of years. That is very healthy for the economy. But it's all internal to big command economies. That's one of the reasons why the concept of trade is so ridiculous. I mean, what's called trade would certainly not have been called trade by Adam Smith. Outsourcing happens to send goods across the border into the United States, but it's under the control of a command economy. In fact, a network of command economies, which work the way I just quoted, the oligopolistic competition and strategic integration. And the same is true of most of what's called trade. I mean, nobody really studies this much, so you don't have really accurate numbers. But if you take the numbers that are guessed at by economists who look at it, take, say, NAFTA. One of the great things about NAFTA is supposed to have been that it increased trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Well, it certainly increased cross-border transfers of material objects. But is that trade? Well, it depends. It turns out that the percentage of interaction that's intra-firm, internal to a command economy, went from about 50% before NAFTA to about 2/3 after NAFTA. That's not trade any more than if GM shifts something from Indiana to Illinois. Happens across an international border so that you can take advantage of rotten working conditions and low wages and no environmental constraints, but it's no more trade than if the Kremlin moved something from Poland to Hungary or something like that. And in fact, it's very possible, if anybody ever bothered to study it, that actual trade has even declined since NAFTA. I mean, nobody studies it because it's the wrong questions to ask in the ideological framework that we're supposed to accept. But if you did ask it, you might very well find that, just as it turns out after NAFTA that, another great thing about NAFTA for Mexico is that foreign investment shot up, which it did. But a little footnote is that total investment declined because Mexican investment declined even faster than foreign investment went up, for the simple reason that Mexican businesses can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. Corporate systems. Should we approve of it? Well, that's not the only question. There are other options. For example, another option is to work to improve working conditions, labor standards, environmental conditions, and so on in the places to which they are outsourcing. Okay, that'll tend to equalize the conditions. Is that a utopian measure? Not at all. It's been used. You take a look at the European Union. Before the European Union integrated, substantial efforts were made and substantial costs were assumed to raise the level of the poorer countries, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, to raise labor standards, raise wages, improve conditions, enough, and get to the northern standards, but enough so that when they finally integrated, there wasn't a very severe blow against the wages and living standards of northern workers. Well, that's because they have a kind of social market economy and a more or less functioning democratic system. And the same could have been done with regard to NAFTA. In fact, it was proposed by the U.S. labor movement, but never entered the discussion. And the same, because corporate media are against it and the elites are against it, and the same could be true of the whole outsourcing story. So there are other options. It's not either let the command economies maximize their own profit and power, or else, you don't have a job. There are other options.